Welcome to It's a Good Good podcast.
My name is Hayden.
I'm Chris.
I'm Harry.
And yeah, we're just a bunch of guys having talks about theology, the Bible, and God. And basically our whole goal is just to be accessible to anyone, that you don't need a theology seminary degree
Right.
to be able to talk about God. We want to make it easy and
I
simple.
definitely don't have any of those degrees.
Yeah.
That's so true, though. I mean, you just have to be interested in it. All the information's out there.
The last few weeks, we talked about the Bible and what it is, where it came from. And then our next conversation was why have faith in it? Or at least that's kind of where our previous conversation led us. And then we said, why have faith in this Bible if it's a human and divine word? Which I think there are many reasons, and we talked about some of those last week. We also talked about what does it mean to have faith. And one of the things that we said was one of the most important claims of the Bible is that God is committed to humanity in spite of their failings, and he's committed to them beyond death. And we see that, cornerstone, capstone point with Jesus. But if we want to know what the Bible is claiming about not only just resurrection, but all the things that it claims, because it makes many claims, we should probably read it. So we've done one book study already,
Jonah.
which was Jonah. I thought that was really good. So we're trying our hand on another this week, which is 1 Samuel, and just picked by the divinity of God.
Yeah.
So, Chris, do you have anything about like an overview of 1 Samuel?
Yeah, we don't really know who wrote it.
Perfect.
People would say that it's possible to attribute some of it to Samuel, but at some point he dies.
Right.
So, it'd be pretty hard for him to write after that.
They asked the same question about the Torah with Moses, because
Yes.
his death is in that. It's like, who wrote
Yeah.
post his death?
That one's a little bit different because you could say, okay, Moses at least says something about Deuteronomy that's talking from the first person in parts of it.
Right.
But this one, you're like, this is kind of just like prose. There's some poetry in it, but it doesn't seem like Samuel could have written all of it because, he was dead. So we don't really know who wrote it. Another thing is that 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are actually one book, but the scroll was too big, so they had to cut it down. So they cut it in half, and they picked a pretty interesting part to cut in half. The
Yeah.
demise of Saul and the rise of David, where David's pretty much at his high point. And yeah, that's about what we have. Samuel takes place after Judges, and this is at like one of Israel's lowest points. They've come out of Exodus, they've been entered into the Promised Land, and things were going well, and then they just series after series of just messing up and being terrible people, and God's judges trying to right them, but just being ineffective because no one's listening.
The story so far is, like you said, starts in the garden, and then sin is introduced, and sin spirals until we get to Abraham. And then Abraham, God says, I'm going to reestablish my kingdom, my rule, my family through your family. And we see Abraham, his family ends up going to Egypt, being basically given shelter there from a famine at the time. But then they just stay in Egypt for a super long time, and eventually they're growing so huge in number that the Egyptians are terrified of them. So they put them in slavery, and that's where we get the Moses story. And Moses does the plagues and all those things, and then he leads his people out of Egypt to almost the promised land, but they don't get there because they don't have faith in that they can overtake it. And so Moses and that generation die, and then Joshua comes up, and he is the next kind of ruler, and he spends his life conquering the promised land.
Messing people up.
Yep.
One after another, dude.
Yep. So then eventually they inherit the promised land, but they have no real authority. And so the book of Judges is the theme of, and everyone did what was good in their own sight. And then so we have this period of leaders that rise up that are called judges, and some of them are military leaders, other ones are kind of what we would think of as prophets. And then at the end of the book of Judges, after all these leaders rise and fall, every single time there's a leader, the people are like, yay, God! And then the leader leaves, and then they're like, boo, God!
We like having leaders.
Yep. And then so 1 Samuel starts out, and it's a story of Samuel becoming a prophet, and then the people come to Samuel and say, we want a king, give us a king like everyone else. And so that's kind of the story of Samuel, is Samuel's rise to become a prophet, and then the rise of kings, the age of kings. Man, we're talking some cool like Lord of the Rings stuff.
The Age of Kings.
The age of kings in Israel.
Yeah, I would also say, too, at a high level, this book is an incredibly good read. I feel like we've picked two very good book studies to do, because Jonah's nice and short and like pretty easy to understand, especially when you talk about it. This is just like a thriller novel, almost, in form of a Bible story.
I would say, too, the part about Samuel can be a little boring, but it really sets up the rest of the
It
book.
does. No, it's almost like a book starting slow.
Yeah.
Like
You get invested.
It's got phases, too. There's multiple main characters. You don't even meet David until like halfway through.
Yeah. I feel like we should talk about at least Samuel for a bit. I know he's not like the most interesting part of the book,
He's pretty one-dimensional.
but I think you see really the theme of the book of Samuel just in Samuel's life.
Yeah.
And a huge part of that is Hannah's prayer at the beginning. It's basically talking about humility versus pride. And that's what you see over the whole book of Samuel. It's God exalts the humble and destroys the prideful.
Yep.
The beginning of chapter 2 is this poem right in the middle of this prose book we're reading. And it's just basically just saying, hey, God, like, you've answered my prayer. You gave me a son. These are the reasons I love you. And some of the things that she says is, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread. Those who are hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. And then right here in verse 6, the Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. Lord makes the poor and rich. He brings the low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from dust. He lifts up the needy. It's just this back and forth, but it's really setting up what's about to happen with Samuel going to Saul, somebody that is prideful, and seeing what happens with that, and then somebody that starts out humble, like David, and seeing what happens there.
And even in verse 10, she says, he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. There are no kings in Israel yet when she's saying this. So, yeah, I think you're right. This poem has been entered in here, and maybe Hannah prayed that, right in that moment, and she could just kind of see what was coming or whatever. But this prayer is definitely in there to say, like, this is the story you're about to read.
This is the thesis
These are
statement.
the things you should be looking for when you listen to this story.
It's almost like Shakespearean, opening scene. We've got a little poem overview of the theme of this story.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Another thing about Samuel that's really neat is Samuel is basically Moses 2.0. There's a lot of synergy between Samuel and Moses. I have some of it written down because this isn't all of it, but comparing the two characters, like, this is what a person would be thinking when they read Samuel after reading stories about Moses. They both had remarkable childhoods, being nurtured in their earliest years by mothers of faith, but raised during their formative years in environments that were not their own homes. Because Samuel was taken out of his home. Both grew up in pretty corrupt places. So it's kind of neat to see that, because Moses is kind of the way, he's the way that God enacts his exodus for his people and his salvation for his people at that time. And Samuel is kind of coming up on that, which would be the David story, not the Saul story, but giving his people power.
That's a common theme, too, when it comes to, protagonists in the Bible, to, say a couple of things that this person is similar to the person that was just mentioned in that sort of prophet line.
Yeah, one big one that stood out to me is Samuel goes to David's home, and David's dad, Jesse, has all his sons kind of line up, and it uses the words, and they all pass before Eli, and then they pass before him, they pass before him, they pass before him, and then when David passes before him, they make special note to say his face was glowing.
Ooh.
Which, if you're hearing these pass in front of and glowing face, you're like, oh shoot, this is I should be thinking about Moses when Moses was on the mountain and God passed before him, and then his face was glowing.
Yeah.
Man, all these catchphrases that we are immune to in this day and age, because they might just be turn of phrases that we're not used to, or they might just be literary evidence that it's really hard to pick up on the first time you read these things through.
Yeah, it's so loaded.
Yeah.
We can get into a lot of detail.
The hyperlinks.
Yeah, I think a couple things going back to the beginning of the story is this theme that both in the Samuel story and the David story God chooses someone outside of the line that you would expect for the person to do his work. So Eli is the descendant of Levi, who would be the Levitical priests, and the line that if you're a Jewish person, you would know that if I'm in the tribe of Levi, then my job is to be a priest. But Samuel comes from outside of that line and like usurps that line essentially. Eli and all of his sons die in a really crazy tragic event.
Basically just because they're ignoring God.
Yep.
They're just going direct. Well, they're going
I will
directly against
take
him.
your sons from you. Yeah.
And then so God establishes Samuel from this other line outside of that. And then you have Saul, who is the first king to be anointed, but then David comes from this other family and is anointed and raised above that. So I just think that's interesting. And that's like a normal theme, that the person you expect is not the person you get almost all the time.
I would say it's probably also a big reversal for the times, because I bet back then Kings, it was all about the genealogy. It was that son for a long period of time, and here it's all jumbled. It's like God doesn't necessarily pick leaders the same way that we would probably pick leaders.
Yeah, and I mean, that's explicitly said when Samuel goes to Jesse's family and he sees the oldest son and he's like, oh, this is the guy. He's big, he's tall, he's strong. And then God says, it is not by human standards that I judge people, but I judge people by the heart.
Right.
And you see that happen a couple times too. Another place where that stood out to me, Eli lets his son sin, and the sin is, it says, sacrifices will not atone for it, which is interesting, that God, again, the normal way of atoning for sin at this point was to sacrifice.
Yep.
But in this moment, God is saying, whatever you sacrifice is not good enough, because I choose the worth of the sacrifice here.
I like that though, because it takes it so much off of like how perfect the sacrifice needs to be, and then it's all in how God takes it, because the power is on Him.
Yeah, and you see the parallel from that part of the Samuel story to the Saul and David story, where Saul's biggest mess up was that he was supposed to go and rout this enemy, kill all the people, kill the king, kill the livestock, kill everything. That was his job. And instead, he spares the king and he spares all the good livestock. Then when Samuel comes and is like, Saul, why did you spare all these things? Saul says, well, we saved the best of the livestock so that we could sacrifice them to the Lord. And Samuel's like, don't you know that the Lord doesn't desire sacrifices, he desires obedience. It's this big reversal where Saul tries to hide behind his religiosity by saying, oh, look how I'm going to give 800 sacrifices to the Lord.
All you needed to do was listen to what I told you to do.
Yeah.
I don't care about the sacrifices. That's an interesting hallmark too, because I feel like prior to this book, sacrifices are explicitly very important. It's been like a hallmark throughout the entire Torah up until now.
That's true.
So now it's like calling it out it's almost similar to Paul being like, circumcision is not important. Like, these things are not important. You know what's important? Faith.
Well, even all the way back to Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
The sacrifice isn't important. We don't know why it happened.
We have no idea.
But it wasn't just the sacrifice. There was something else more there.
Yeah. So that was one. Both of those stories illustrate one big theme that I think this part of the Bible is trying to get us to understand. And for me, that's a claim that we should be picking up from the Bible, is that being religious is not what God, at least not what the God of the Bible is looking for. He's looking for people that have faith in His word, and because of their faith, they obey it.
Yeah, but if you want to know about that, just listen to the previous podcast, Label of Faith, because that actually is a nice precursor to this conversation, because it's not sacrifices, it's not doing things, it's not like outward works. I think works is a big part of that, but it's faith. Whatever that means to you.
One thing I want to bring up that I thought was really cool, I didn't really see until we started doing this study, in like the history of the Jewish people, you see a lot of the most significant patriarchs being these really great shepherds. And you see that with David as well. But the very first time we're introduced to Saul, he lost some donkeys and he's trying to find them. And so there's this idea that this guy can't even keep track of donkeys, which are a much bigger, easier to handle animal than sheep are. And so that kind of points forward to saying, hey, this guy is already a bad shepherd. He's not going to be good when he becomes king.
Yeah, and the other thing that points to that is when Saul is like coronation ceremony is about to pop up, they do this weird ritual thing where they cast lots to see which tribe the king should come from, and then they cast lots to see which family the king should come from, and then they cast lots to see who it should be, and the lot falls on Saul, and Saul is hiding at that moment, and they have to go find him.
Yeah.
And anyone who's reading that story is like, this sounds really familiar to a story that I just heard a little bit ago about the story of Achan. The story when
Joshua.
Yep, and Joshua, they walk around the Jericho 7 times, Jericho falls down, and similar to the story in Saul, they're instructed to go and destroy everything in the city. Don't take anything.
Yep.
But Achan takes some things, and he hides them in his tent. And then you have the same process where they cast lots to see the tribe. They
The
cast
most
lots
stressful lot casting there's
to see
ever
the
been.
family. They cast lots to see who it is, and then they have to go find these things that they're hiding. And so I think you're supposed to know, even though God is saying, go ahead and do it,
Right.
it's still a sin, and the person they're choosing is wrong.
I think it's interesting to note, too, that Saul has already been chosen by Samuel
yeah.
prior to that even happening.
Yep.
So, like, the lots being cast, kind of, they don't solidify it. It's just like a reflection of what you just read.
Yeah. Well, you even see it, too, when the Lord is speaking through Samuel to Saul. He says, "Behold the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall rule over my people." This word for rule actually has got 2 meanings. So it can mean rule, but it can also mean restrain and, like, arrest and, like, hold back. So, like, right there, like, God's, like, already putting it in, like, hey, like, this guy will rule, but he's also going to, like, hold you back. And it doesn't really appear anywhere else in the Bible with this word for rule. It's mostly, like,
Really?
restrain and, like, hold back.
Could be more of a negative connotation than
Yeah.
positive.
Yeah.
Whoa.
There's so much there.
Yeah, and before they even appoint the king, God tells Samuel, he's like, look, here's what's going to happen when you
Yes.
appoint a king. He's going to rule over you with an iron fist. You're going to be going into war all the time. He's going to take a bunch of your money to fund these wars. He's
Yeah.
going to take your sons to fight in these wars. And so you need to go tell the people that that's what's going to happen. And
Well,
they're
Samuel's
all like,
mad.
oh, yeah.
He has to like go away because he's mad that people want the king. And then he talks to God, and God's like, you can do it, but tell them what's going to happen. And then he tells them all this thing, and they're like, that's okay.
We want
We
that.
still want that.
Yeah, we want so much to be like our neighbors,
Yes.
our neighboring society, that we'll sacrifice whatever it takes. We're willing to give up our own sons for the cause of war.
Yeah, we
to
have such this
to do it.
need of like a human ruler, and like it's explicitly said in here that like God wishes to be that ruler,
Yeah.
but the people ask for it, so He gives it to them. But like, I wonder what it is in us that like we need to be ruled by other people.
Yeah.
We do crave that. I don't know why. Sometimes I wonder if it's like natural or unnatural to like have management in companies or to
Yeah.
have leadership structure in other places instead of just having like one massive co-op. I don't know if it's unnatural or not to have the system, but I do think it's really, really easily abused. Even if you have like a small amount of power or lordship over somebody, like it's really hard to be a Christ follower or something like that. Someone that you admire when you have that piece. So yeah, it's just really easy to abuse, as evidenced in Saul.
I think you see that theme, and that I think that's another thing that we should be taking out of this story, that this story is claiming, is that we shouldn't be putting our faith in the rulership of people, even though the Bible is clear, like we should be respecting our authority, and that's another theme that comes out of this story.
Yeah.
Even though that's very clear, like our authority should be God. And the other hilarious thing that I thought when I was listening to this story again is right before they begged to appoint a king, you have this really weird story of the Ark of the Covenant going to the Philistines, and like the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, they take it to their city and like cancerous
stuff
tumors
starts
comes
happening.
out and like tons of people die and like their idols are like falling down, like worshiping the
they
ark.
put it in their like temple with their other god, and it's just destroyed.
Yeah, and then so they do that at like 2 different cities, and then the Philistines are like, "Get this thing out of here!"
Make some
Like,
golden tumors
yeah,
and some golden whatevers.
yep.
Yeah.
So the point is like the presence of God just conquered their enemies. They didn't even need to go to war,
Right.
But they're still saying like,
But they screwed
need a
up
king.
because it should have been God telling them to go to war. Instead, they just thought, "Hey, if we took this ark with us, like we'd win. Like it's going to be fine."
That's another piece of what you guys just talked about too. Is God's direct nature in this book is very different from others. Like either he'll give vague answers or he'll not be present at all in previous books. In this one, you
that's
can
true.
ask him really direct questions and he'll tell you yes or no. Like
Because you got
should I
that
go-
prophet, though.
Yeah, well, I'm saying David too. David
Yeah.
is like homies with God. He's like, should I go after these guys? And he's like, yes, go after them. You'll be successful. It's like not a man was lost.
Yeah.
They had a huge bounty. I feel like in other books they don't have that direct. Like in Esther, God isn't even mentioned in Esther. I feel like this one's God's a huge, explicit, and like prominent character in this book.
That's
in this
true.
book.
Man, I love this story so much, and it's so heartbreaking, I think, because it's so human, you know? But, man, you have David. He's by far the closest we get to Jesus without actually having Jesus. But you have this guy that's pretty much the perfect ruler. But then he starts screwing up, and it's almost like he's a different character in 2 Samuel, which we won't talk about now. But you see this evidence of what can happen if you do follow God and you do listen to him, and like what can happen there. But it's just tragedy.
yeah. I just thought it was super interesting that the reason they wanted this king was to be like their neighbors, and the war aspect itself was obviously very heavy in their minds.
Yeah.
And just before that, you have the story of God doing the work in the war. And then you see that parallel in David meeting Goliath. And he goes out before Goliath and he's like, it's not by sword or shield that we will conquer our enemies, but by the power of God. And so I think that's supposed to be tying you in from earlier to say David's got the right mindset, and the reason that he's going to be victorious when he is victorious is because he's not putting his hope and his faith in the sword like they were earlier, but he's putting his hope and his faith in the power of God to deliver them.
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting, like almost triple character study, which juxtaposes against like the Israelites as a whole. Like this person, maybe for a short amount of time, but this person did exemplify faith, whether that's like Samuel, Saul for a very short period of time, or not at all, and then David.
Samuel, I mean, he didn't really make any mistakes that we're aware of.
No, he is got a pretty lily white reputation as far as the book portrays.
Especially because he's compared to Moses so much, you think he'd be messing up more.
Yeah,
But when we don't get the whole picture,
we don't know.
We got to realize that too.
So much about the characters in the Bible that and like that's what I was talking about, like the historicity of this. Like David was a real king. Like that's in the record books. Like that actually happened. Was Samuel a real person too? Like, do we have documentation of him?
I don't know. So when you start talking about documentation, it gets muddy.
Yeah.
Especially because honestly, the people at this time that were the best at documenting things were these people.
Yeah. So this is the best source.
This should
of
be
information.
a really good source of who was alive and who wasn't. But most people won't give you that because it's also a religious book.
Yeah.
So it's kind of sucks.
It does kind of suck.
Yeah, I would say that you could probably make a pretty good case a lot of these people were people, but then you get into when was this written and like were these like figureheads or But yeah, David he had so much influence that he was recorded by other cultures.
Yeah, he did exist.
So, I mean, I don't know how much you guys want to talk about this, but everybody always talks about the story of David and Goliath. And something that I have been thinking about, I just did youth group with the youth, and I was going over this story again because we were talking about like young leaders. And one of the things that stuck out to me this last time was that why didn't Saul go out to fight? Like David goes out in his place, and Saul like gives David like he tries to make him like a good warrior, like he seems like a good guy, but at the same time like I never crossed my mind before like why isn't Saul like he's the king of Israel, like he should be the one out in front lines, like that's how God's kings, like that's how his people work.
There's not even a whisper of him being like, should I be the one
Instead
to go
he sends
battle
out this
guy?
kid.
Yeah.
Obviously he doesn't have a lot of faith at this point, otherwise he'd be the one out there. Instead he sends out this kid to do his work for him. That's insane.
Yeah, I think it's that faith piece is, you know, you have this little conversation where David comes up to Saul and he's like, hey, I'm going to go out here and I'm going to do it. And Saul's like, you're just a kid. Like, for sure you're not going to go do that.
Yeah.
You're going to die. And David's like, no. When I take care of my sheep back at home, like I've fought bears, I've fought lions, I always come out on the other side, and it's because God's with me, so I know that I'll be fine. That moment is supposed to be drawing your attention to the very clear difference. Like, this is the difference of what makes Saul not an okay king and what makes David an okay king in God's eyes.
Especially at this point, Saul's got everything he needs to defeat Goliath, like on paper. You know, he's a king, he's well fought in battle, like he knows how to fight. But then you have David, who is not ill prepared at all, actually. God's been preparing his whole life for this moment. Yes, God obviously stepped in, and it was by God's power that David won, but he'd also been fighting off bears and lions. Like, God made sure he was ready. And then you have David and Saul at this point, and the person that goes out to fight is the one with more faith, not the one who should be the one fighting.
The violence in this book as well.
Oh yeah.
Kills him with a stone, chops his head off with his own sword. Yeah,
it's metal, dude.
And I don't mean to bring this up every single time we do a book study, but like, man, this is an awfully dramatic book. Like, there's a lot of literary themes that mean a lot of specific things. Like, not to be like, did it happen or not, but like, it's written very well. You know, like when you read the Exodus, that's a little bit more cut and dry. It's a little bit more informational. This is like a very dramatic, almost like Shakespearean retelling of like, who knows what if it actually happened or not.
That's a good point, and this. To kind of hone in on that, the literary like genius and nature of these books, and I think a lot of that is kind of like a Shakespearean sort of history where they're not trying to tell you history as it happened.
No.
They're trying to tell you the theology of what was happening with this history that did happen. And so the way that they do that is expertly crafting things like to say, you know, the passing by earlier, like, hey, we're telling you now
Cluing you in.
that David is in the presence of God, like he's got this faith. And they use all these literary devices to say, here's the story, and here's what was happening in the God side of the story. And so they're not trying to tell you this is what happened exactly as it happened. I think what they're trying to tell you, and I think this is one thing that we should be taking away from the whole Bible, is we're not trying to get a story of what happened. We're trying to help you understand the relationship between God and humanity. And in this particular story, we're trying to tell you the relationship between God and the kings of Israel, and the people of Israel in general. And so they use poems and they use literary devices to act as metaphors to say, here's what did happen, but in the background, here's how God was at work in these stories.
I feel like they do that really successfully in 1 Samuel. Like, it's the overarching theme that we're kind of honing in on, or themes, they're pretty explicit in a lot of different places. So
yeah, I know there's a point for the way other books were written in the Old Testament, but I wish more of them were like Samuel. At least for an English reader in like America, it's an easy thing to read because it's captivating.
It is.
And like you have characters that you get attached to.
Well, and there's like a story arc, you know, it's not just like a bunch of information. It's not like 10 pages of genealogy or something like that. I do see you have written right there an evil spirit from God.
Yeah.
Which I definitely wanted to talk about because that was interesting.
Where is that at?
So that was
Sends the evil spirit from God into Saul.
Yeah.
And drives him insane.
I hadn't caught this before. All I had noticed is that there was an evil spirit. So one of David's roles is to go like comfort the king by playing his lyre. And so he goes in there, and then it says on multiple occasions, like
Twice.
or 4 times.
Oh, yeah.
That it says an evil spirit from God was in Saul, and then Saul chucks his spear
tries
at
to kill
David and tries to kill
Whoa!
him. Yeah, I had always just heard in my other readings an evil spirit was in Saul.
From God.
But it does, at least in my translation, say from God.
Mine
What
too.
what verse is that? Is that the end of 17, or is that...
It happens multiple times.
Yeah.
I think I read at least twice. He does the exact same thing where he chucks a spear and tries to kill him. And that's like mirrored against and then God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you mean?
We got 1 Samuel 18:10, it happens, and 1 Samuel 16:14, and 15 and 1 Samuel 19:9.
God, why you got to do Saul so wrong?
We won't get anything new from the Hebrew translation.
Dang
you're
it.
wondering. That's a hard thing. That's like the Pharaoh thing, and it really is like, is this just the way they're writing it? It had to have come from somebody, so it came from God.
No, I feel like that's a pretty interesting claim.
Yeah.
I don't know either, but it freaks me out.
I mean,
Yeah.
it could be harmful spirit too. That helps you at all. I mean, I think the idea of God sending something evil is kind of weird,
Yeah.
but harmful is a little bit easier to wrap my mind around.
Harmful, still though.
It's still not great.
Yeah.
I still don't like it. I mean, if we're going to take it at face value, like, why would God send at least something that's not good, like a bad spirit to somebody?
I think probably we are supposed to have the story of Pharaoh and Egypt in our minds just because there are so many parallels in the rest of the story. And so, yeah, I think we are supposed to be seeing Saul as the new Pharaoh and David as kind of the new Moses that leads them out in this case, which is interesting. But in both stories, I think we have to remember Pharaoh and Saul made their own choices first. They both already had decided to put their faith in themselves and to not listen to the voice of God. There is a theme, and it's a theme that I struggle with being okay with, but there is this theme in the Bible where after it seems like someone has made up their mind, God sometimes ramps up the ante a little bit and to say, like, all right, you've chosen not to listen to me.
Give you over.
Yeah,
to
I'm going to
this.
give you over to that.
Yeah, it's good to mention as well too. Like Saul's already on a downward trajectory at this point.
right.
That's not like the first thing that happens to him. He's
Yeah.
already going down.
And at least in my mind, when I picture this relationship between Saul and David, like, you got to imagine how much jealousy Saul has.
A
like,
lot.
For a God that was once with him to be seen in David now, that's doing way better things than Saul ever did. And then not only that, but David's best friend is Saul's
Jonathan,
son.
yeah.
Yep.
Which is a really cool relationship.
Two things too. We can get into that. Two things. When Jonathan dies at the end, I was so sad.
Oh,
that was
yeah.
like
He
a
dies
James
with his
Cameron.
father.
Oh,
Yeah.
dies with his father. It's like, you're supposed to be second in command, David. Like, you
Yeah.
guys are bros.
I mean, Jonathan's an excellent character because he's kind of like Samuel in this story where he really doesn't do anything wrong. Like, he follows his father and defends David. Like, it's crazy.
Plus, you have this sweet story of him and his armor bearer who, like, just
Yes.
go
Yeah,
out into
dude.
the battle
Awesome.
lines together, like, by themselves, and then the Philistines are like, all
Yeah.
right, come on
Come
up.
on up.
And they just, like,
God is with us.
take down 30 people, yeah.
Jonathan doesn't get enough credit, man.
No,
he's the man.
Yeah, he is a really cool character.
The other thing I was going to say, though, is that the jealousy that Saul has for David is like 4 or 5 times exacerbated by people remembering the line in the song where it's like, where it's like Saul kills his thousands, David kills his tens of thousands. And like, that must have been the catchiest tune back in the day, because when somebody hears about David that doesn't know him, the first thing they say is like, and did you hear that song? Like, and then it spits out that line.
Somebody just humming it down the
yeah,
hall.
dude. It's like, "There's tens
Saul
of
killed
thousands."
his
Chucks another
thousands,
spear.
and David killed his 10,000.
Yeah, dude, like, that's my jam, dude. That guy from the song, he's the guy from the song.
It's kind of messed up, though. Like, why couldn't it just be a good song about both of them?
Well, I think it is supposed to be a good song about both of them.
But he
they
takes
were-
it the wrong way.
They were telling it how it was,
Mm-hmm.
like that Saul killed a lot of people, but David killed more. And Saul could be happy about that and say, like, my general, it killed a bunch of Philistines.
He's the
and,
best
like,
general
that was
ever.
under my command.
Instead, he got jealous.
Yeah, but, I mean, what wouldn't you normally attribute that to the leader? Like, even if you have a good general, it's not like, hey, my general defeated this army. It's
Yeah.
your king's army defeated it.
Who knows? Maybe David was just so beautiful that as soon as people saw him, they were like,
I mean,
yeah.
they're both beautiful. You got these two handsome guys just
Dang it.
ruling.
Yeah.
Saul's getting old. Saul's getting real old.
Yeah.
Maybe he's got like a George Clooney thing going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is supposed to be a point that continues to illustrate the divide that's happening. Is
Yeah.
that some people are following Saul, some people are following David, and the kingdom's kind of being split in two. And to illustrate a reason why Saul is starting to feel this jealousy in his heart.
It also
Good or
says,
bad.
too, that Saul's afraid. I think that also comes from, like,
Became
knowing
afraid
that,
of him.
yeah, that David has God with him. He's obviously way more powerful than Saul ever was. And just he knows that David's going to, like, he's going to be king. I mean, it should be Jonathan, but Jonathan would probably, like, elevate David to the same level as him. And I think that's probably scaring him because you have this history, maybe not in this kingdom, but in other kingdoms, of the next line killing their kings off so that they can be kings right away.
And I think at that time, too, God has already left Saul. Like, explicitly, God's voice left Saul, and then it was obviously with David. So I think, who knows, like, how driven crazy you could be by knowing that you were God's chosen, and then all of a sudden...
Your children love him more than you.
Everyone does, everyone's thinking about him, drives him insane. Yeah, I think the other thing, too, I'm pretty sure by the end of 1 Samuel, David has 2 wives, because he takes Abigail, too.
Yeah, so that is an interesting theme, and I think again we're supposed to kind of be picturing this Moses kind of character, where another point of the story is that eventually there will come this person who rightfully establishes God's kingdom here on earth. And we get Abraham, and we're like, oh, it's going to be Abraham. And then Abraham messes up. And then we get Moses, and we're like, oh, it's going to be Moses. And then Moses messes up. And then we get to David, and it's like, oh, for sure, it's going to be David. Because he's actually a king. Like, he's establishing this kingdom. He's got everything going for him. And then he takes 2 wives, and you see other elements of sin begin to creep into that.
Yeah, the Bible's never really explicitly against it, but you see a lot of bad things happen because of polygamy.
Yeah.
And like, when you start reading the Old Testament like this, it's not hard to see why some traditions like Catholicism forbid teachers from being married. We've spoken about this before, but everybody in this room believes women leadership should be equal to man's leadership, like in a marriage or out of a marriage. But you see these stories of the Old Testament of men losing their minds over women and all this infighting going on because of more than one woman. Like, go back to Abram. And then even before that, like, go back to Adam and Eve. Now, that story isn't, like, necessarily literal, but, like, a lot of people take that the wrong way. And they go, oh, when men and women get together, this is when sin happens. No, when people get together, that's when sin happens.
Or when you use it for your own benefit instead of, like, what it's explicitly made to do. I feel like, once again, the character study, David starts to fall into the same traps. And we talked about that the other day. When you have ultimate power, you believe that you don't need anything or anybody to operate because you're above it all. And that does not help your relationship with God.
No.
Yeah, I think it's important for us just to say this because I think a few of the things that I hear why people don't put their faith in the Bible is one of these is the polygamy thing. They think that the Bible is advocating for polygamy because David has 2 wives. Rachel and Leah are Jacob's wives. You know, you see it happen many times. But if you read the story, it's very clear that those relationships never work out well. Like, they always have bad conflict with the wives, and they have huge family issues that happen because of that. And the Bible, this is one thing that I think we should be taking away from this story is the Bible doesn't always work with explicit this is right, this is wrong. But it uses the narratives to show you what's right and what's wrong in the eyes of God. And so we should know by now, and the story of Lamech should make it very clear that having more than one wife is like a token sign of sin in a person. So we should know by now that David's in error when he has 2 wives. And I think one point that I notice is he accumulates wives and he accumulates concubines. But at the end of 2 Samuel, there's a point where he leaves his kingdom to go like do a battle or something. And he leaves his castle or whatever, his place in the care of these concubines. And it goes out of its way. This is after David has been confronted about Bathsheba. It goes out of his way to say, and those concubines were barren until the end of their days, and like David had never slept with them.
Whoa.
And so I think the point of the story is David had this sin issue, and he gave himself over to it. He was confronted with it after Bathsheba when he was at his lowest point, and after that he turned to have faith in God and didn't even make use, I guess, if you want to say that, of his concubines. I think that was supposed to be a moment where you're going, okay, David figured it out now. And you see that happen in the story of Moses too, where Moses has this sin, but then after that, every time that he's confronted with a similar choice, he makes the right choice.
Yeah. Another nice little literary device to make us feel good at the end of Samuel 2, 2 Samuel.
I like what you said, though. Just because it's displayed in the Bible doesn't mean it's advocating for it. I think people really get that wrong.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of terrible things like God's people do in the Bible that are definitely wrong, and the Bible's saying that, but you just won't see it if you're not reading it in its full picture.
Yeah, and God uses those consequences usually to have good outcomes in the end. And so, for instance, Rachel and Leah, they end up giving birth to the 12 tribes and some other concubines too. They ended up giving birth to the 12 tribes of Israel. And so God has the ability to take sin and use it for good. But I think, because people see the patriarchs of the Bible do things and they think that it's okay. But almost always when there is some repercussion that comes out of it, like that's the point of the story, is to be honing in on that. People have also issues with, and rightfully so, Joshua's conquering of the promised land.
It's a lot of death.
But that wasn't the first option. The first option was that Moses and his people would go in there and take it, and we don't know what God's plan. We don't know what God's plan was to do that. But instead, they had to wander around for 40 years and allow those nations to grow up into powerful people and to inhabit the land.
So you're saying if you feel uncomfortable with something right away in the Bible, maybe you should just keep reading because there might be a less explicit reason why that negative thing is in the Bible.
And also read before
back.
it. Like see why these people are in these situations.
The higher level context of it.
Yeah, and like all this stuff we're talking about, like pointing back to Moses and everything. Most people don't read Samuel like that. They just see Samuel and say, "Oh, this is just another prophet." But like, look at what it's referencing, and then David, like same thing. Look at what he's referencing, and look what he's pointing towards. Yeah. Like, yes, he was a good king, and yes, he has a bunch of flaws, but man, the whole reason David existed was to continue his line.
I think that's a good point. And I think the reason people don't look for these things and the reason why people just kind of discredit the Old Testament in a lot of ways is because they view it as history. And so they're not looking for the literary devices and the poetry and the things like that, because they're like, okay, what is written is what happened, and that's all we have. So you read it in the same way that you would read a history textbook. You're like, oh, I wonder what happened in World War II. So you like open up a history textbook and you read it and you're like, all right, that's what happened. No reason to go back and read that again. Like, I know what happened.
Well, and I love actually coming at it from my perspective too, because like 2 pages into it, my mind switched. It was like, this is not a history book, dude. This is a Shakespearean play waiting to be played out right now.
Yeah.
And like, that's just how I read it. And it was really engaging to read.
Cool.
But like we've been talking about living in the tension. I feel like when reading, especially a book like this, you need to live in the tension of like, yes, these were people who may have actually lived. Like King David was actually a person. This story is not trying to tell you what happened. It's somewhere in the middle, using those people to tell a much deeper story or truth about God.
Right. And I think, we would say this all definitely could have happened, but the more important part is why it happened and like what it's trying to tell us.
Yeah, for me, I can totally be on board with the fact that all this stuff happened exactly as it happened, and that God orchestrated these events in some ways to make it as poetically beautiful and as, hearkening back as it is. I think that could totally be true. But I also think that the whole Old Testament uses this style where it tells you history, but again, like I said, it's trying to point you not to the people and the places and the things, but point you to God and to say, this is what God has done through the story of Israel.
I really like that. I didn't necessarily like that in some of the other books of the Bible that I read, but I do thoroughly appreciate it in this one.
I think this one is one of the easier books to get on board with too. Like everything in here, nothing seems super miraculous. Just reading it as opposed to like story of Jonah, like getting in a whale, surviving for 3 days.
Like more fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, but just so much happens though still. Like even if it doesn't seem miraculous when you're like reading it line by line, the whole idea of this boy becoming a king this way out of the wrong lineage, like
true rags to riches story,
The more I read the Old Testament and the more I get into it, it's weird, like when you start reading something like Matthew, you actually start to get excited by the genealogies because you read them and you're like, I know that person.
The characters,
I know that person. It makes so much more sense when you read the New Testament because you see somebody like David and you go, oh, that's who they were looking for.
Well,
They're looking for a David.
We were just talking about Ruth in church like 2 weeks back, and like Ruth is in the line of David.
Yeah.
She might even be like the mother of Jesse, the father of David. You're like, why is this story in there? And then like near the end, it hits you with that genealogy, and you're like, dang, this is leading up to
Or
the story of
something
David.
like just as cool that I didn't know until like Scott said something about it. But Orpah, Ruth's sister-in-law, is the genealogy of
Philistines.
Goliath, and that's crazy too. And like you see them come head to head at this point of somebody that Orpah didn't really do anything wrong, but Ruth acted in tremendous faith.
She did.
And like you see that through her line. And then when you start reading the genealogy of Jesus, you're like, oh my god,
All of these people
Yeah.
are included. Yeah.
and they were all pointing. All the good points of them were pointing towards Jesus.
And it's funny because at this point in the story, it's just so interesting to me that the Israelites had formed this identity that like genealogy is the most important thing, and like
Yeah.
our religious sacrifices are like the most important thing. And all throughout the Old Testament, God does things in a counterintuitive way to that. So yeah, I just wonder like where did they come up with this idea that like it's so important? Yeah, Ruth was this foreigner that gives birth to the greatest king of all time, like
Yeah.
the father of the greatest king of all time.
And then same thing with David, like
Yeah.
in Bathsheba. Like God's going to use that? Like
Yeah.
that's really weird.
The offspring of that scenario
Yeah.
is going to be a great king, Solomon.
Yeah.
Really subverts everything we think we believe about
It is.
what's important.
It's not only a triple character study on maybe 3 different perceived leaders. It's also a overarching statement of God's leadership. What
Yeah.
that means. There's not one that is like a human being's.
Right, and how God appoints the humble and not the proud.
Yeah. Well, I also think it's interesting too that this story we're supposed to set up to believe, I think, that David is the Messiah. He's
Yeah.
the one that's going to establish Israel.
At the end of 1 Samuel, you're like, yes.
Yeah, and then he doesn't, and he fails hard. And I think he gives his own thesis statement of why he's not the Messiah when he says it's not by a sword that we triumph, but it's by the power of God.
Yeah.
And then the whole rest of the Old Testament is leading up to the Messiah. And then this is our reason that I have faith that the New Testament is a continuation of the Old Testament and that it should be read together, is that when the Messiah does come, it's someone who comes not by the sword, but by the power of God, which is really interesting.
It also helps you understand why the leaders at that time were so confused and like angry at Jesus because they were expecting a David. And like they did not get a David.
They were expecting some Maccabees or something like that
Yeah.
who would come and just destroy all
David
their
and his
enemies.
300 mighty men.
Yeah.
Like,
Nope.
By the way, can we just throw out to like Netflix producers to
It's
make a
amazing.
David's Mighty Men
Yes.
series?
Yes.
I think that would be so cool. The stories that they just throw
I
in
know.
of David's Mighty Men are so cool.
It's awesome. Yeah, I forget if this is 1st or 2nd Samuel because I read them together, but there's this one story of David like hiding from Saul and going and picking up Goliath's sword, like because it's the only weapon he can find. Like that's such a cool story arc.
Yep.
Like like I just imagine David with this massive sword like walking around. This is just it's such a good read. Like if you have not read 1st and 2nd Samuel, you have to read it.
Yeah, we've chosen well when it comes to our book studies. Books that I think anyone could pick up and read and not necessarily see all the things that we're talking about, but it would certainly be enjoyable as well as maybe encourage you to read
Yeah.
some more.
Yeah, I would at least encourage listeners to reread at least parts of the Old Testament that are interesting to you with the lens of, okay, this isn't just history, but I should be looking for theology in this. And I think that's when the pages come to life.
Yeah.
Shout out to Canyon Coffee for the delicious coffee we've been drinking today. If you've been watching our videos, then you see it, but if you've only been listening to the audio, then you don't know that we are run on Canyon Coffee Roasters. And also the music that you hear is from Clink Tracks and also John Jones Project. So thanks to you all for making awesome music that we can share.
Yeah.